Isn't IBM somewhat naive contributing open source in this case? Well, in the short run, definitely it looks that way. Okay, in the short run, IBM seems to be giving away its competitive edge, because now the competitors like HP can say, hey, you know what? Our own file system really sucks. Let's go ahead and borrow the file system from IBM. Now, if you think about it from HP's perspective, would you do that? Admitting that your own file system is inferior and decided to say, well, you know what, since IBM has open sourced their stuff, it is superior, we'll choose to use their stuff too. What is that going to tell your customers? Your product is not really that good, right? So right off the bat, that kind of worry is already kind of negligible. Now, the overall system performance, has many factors. What file system you run is simply one of the many factors. In other words, if I put the IBM file system onto this computer and I don't change anything else, just change the file system, yes, I will have a much more efficient file system, but as a whole, I'm still limited by the design of this particular box. So HP may have their own way of configuring an entire system. Just improving the file system is not going to be improving the overall performance all that much. Now, what is even more important of why open source is a good idea is something like this. Once IBM open sourced the file system, let me just kind of highlight the portion that I'm talking about. Once IBM open sourced its file system, the super duper high performance file system, any developer, including amateurs like myself, can review, fix, or enhance the file system. In other words, I can go in and go like, well, let's see how they did this. Okay, wow, they really have some really great ideas here, here, and here. But you know what? I found there's a little bit of a problem here. Okay, so if I find problems, whether it's a performance issue, a security issue, or a stability issue, I can go back to IBM and say, you know what? This is a great file system, but I can see certain things that you can improve on that. Okay, so IBM can actually take on that and go like, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Let's integrate your change or your suggestion into the file system. But I'm an amateur developer, but there are other developers from universities who might even look into that for research purposes. Okay, when you go to a graduate program as a graduate student, a lot of times you look into things that are like cutting edge. When something is cutting edge and is open source, it's even better because now you have the license to go in, look into it, figure out how it works, and try to improve it. Okay? Now, all that improvement is open source as well. So all that improvement from different universities, from tons of graduate students, have to go back into the file system. In other words, IBM can now leverage the resources of UCs and all other universities, all the graduate students, to improve their product. So they may start the project, okay? They kickstart the entire thing. They give it, a usable form, and they manage, the releases of the software. They may do all of that stuff, but in the end, they can benefit from many, many developers who are not on the payroll of IBM. Is that doing okay so far? Does it make sense? Okay. So basically, this is just a scenario that summarizes everything that I just talked about. IBM develops and releases its SDFS super duper file system, and I really doubt that IBM would name anything like that. Okay, some companies may, but not IBM. Countless cheap DIYers, do-it-yourselfers, like tech, will start to use the file system, identifying bugs and problems, and these problems are the bug reports will be sent back to IBM. Yep, basically they just ended up with tons of beta testers. Okay, what is beta testing?
When a particular piece of software is nearing completion but is released for further user testing.
Correct. It is for external testing. There are two types of testing when it comes to software testing. One is called, well, there are at least two. One is called alpha testing. Alpha testing means the product is quote unquote done, but it is being tested. No new features are added, it's considered quote unquote done. But the testing is all done internal to the organization who is doing the development. Beta testing, on the other hand, is the software being quote unquote done, but it's released to people outside of the organization for testing purposes. Microsoft does it all the time. Okay, they will do a beta release of Windows 8 before it is done, and they will collect all the information, bug reports and whatnot, by from people who were using Windows 8, beta. Okay, so beta testing simply means a company, an organization says, okay, I think this is all done, but we're still testing it. So for any problem, if you find any problems with it, tell us so that we can fix it. That's beta testing. Yep.
So alpha is the internal testing and beta is external testing?
Yes, that's one way to look at it. Alpha testing is inside the organization who is developing the software, and beta testing is outside of the organization. Now with certain products, some people have different views, like Windows Vista. Some people see that as the beta version of Windows 7, except you have to pay for it. Open source software will never have to pay for it, because one of the GPL thing, the GNU public license thing, is the first thing they said is we assume no responsibilities. If you use this, you're on your own. Yep, go ahead.
Now, when the final product is actually released, that's after the beta testing or after the internal alpha testing?
Okay, so first of all, the product is being developed, so that's before beta alpha testing. When the product is quote unquote done, which means we have stopped development, we have stopped adding more features to it, then it enters the alpha testing stage. Alpha testing is internal to the organization, so they have their own test engineers and test team and whatnot. So when they find problems, they will go and fix it. Okay, so after alpha testing, they have identified everything that they can inside the organization. Then they will do the beta testing, which is basically asking people outside of the organization for help to test the product. So in beta testing, the product should be fairly stable already because it has gone past the alpha testing stage already. But there will still be problems because how many people in IBM can or Microsoft can be testing Windows 8? They have a team, they have tools, but they are not as many people as they are outside the organization. That's why they want to do beta testing, because end users like you and I will typically do things that are unexpected from the perspective of the developer. And it's one of those unexpected things that can break the system because the system was not programmed to handle those unexpected cases.
So what you're saying is like in alpha testing, they'd actually be seeking out those problems and trying to actively crash the system or whatever.
Right.
And then as a software designer, that's the way they're going to think, but
right.
The end user might not be as educated on the way that it works and find a even more complicated way to crash it.
Exactly. Yep. The end users will do things that are unexpected.
Yeah.
Yep.
I used to live with some alpha testers for electronic arts.
Mm-hmm.
They would go through every level of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Each glitch.
That's a kind of interesting job. I think after that job, I will be sick and tired of video games. It's like, no more video games. It's work, man. It's work. Okay, so IBM, after the, so we have beta testers. IBM will start to use it on its own servers. So at some point, maybe some researchers, like graduate students from UC Berkeley, will say, hey, you know what? I need to write a dissertation, for PhD, or I need to write a thesis for a master's student. I need to write something, and I'm interested in file systems. Okay. So instead of inventing something from scratch, they may look at SDFS and go like, hey, this is a good platform to begin with because we can read the source code, we understand how it works, and at the same time, because the source code is open, I can make changes to it, and then see if I can even improve it even better, even more. So someone from Berkeley could decide to do that, and then these researchers, not on the payroll of IBM, will do their research and quantify how SDFS compared to all the competing file system. Right off the bat, you get free advertisement, right? because somebody is going to publish a paper in one of those, ACM, which stands for the Association of Computing Machinery, or IEEE, journal, and say, okay, we did some extensive tests here, and these are the charts, graphs, and tables of all kinds of data, of realistic, simulation of how, this is, a file system from Oracle, this is a file system from HP, and this is a file system from IBM, and this is how they compare. So you get free advertisement already, okay, which is good. And if the researchers, continue to look into it and say, but that's not it, that's not the end of the story, we can make it even better, okay, because all these smart people at Berkeley, they want to make things better and finish their degrees and get their master's degree or PhD degree. So due to the licensing, the open source licensing of SDFS, the enhancement also have to be distributed as open source, okay? And in some cases, if IBM look at those changes and say that, hey, these changes are actually good, they can decide to incorporate those enhancements back into their own distribution and back onto their own servers, and therefore improving the performance of their own servers. Okay, yep.
Earlier you said that IBM could release this SDFS and like HP could pick it up.
Yes.
And then sell it. Why would researchers have to distribute it as open source if HP could sell it? What's the difference?
Okay, but HP is not selling the file system. HP is incorporating the file system on its server and selling the server itself.
I get it.
Which is not unsimilar to the routers, Cisco routers. A lot of times they actually use Linux inside.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. Linux is still open source, but Cisco can incorporate the operating system into their hardware product and sell the hardware product itself. Yep.
Look under the hood of the car and see like that car part from a different company.
Right.
It's just like that.
It's kind of like that, except when it's open source, it is, you have to acknowledge that it is open source. Yep. All right. So is this slide okay so far? Have I convinced you that open source, in at least some cases, is not a dumb idea, even from the perspective of for-profit companies? Okay. Very good. Let's see.
Question.
Yep. Go ahead.
Is that like, how they have viruses and such? Is that the way they do it?
No, this is not the way. Now, that's a very interesting question. I'm glad that you brought that up. So the question is, okay, this is not how they write viruses, okay? Okay, I'm going to move a little bit ahead of time because, viruses and stuff like that is actually a future topic. But I can move it to, like, today, okay? Okay, there are three things, okay? So instead of just talking about it, I'm going to kind of write about it, so I can actually do it on screen and it will be recorded. Okay, I'm just going to use LibreOffice Writer. I probably should be using Google, the document thing, because that way I can just send you guys a link and it becomes like official. All right, so let's talk about viruses and stuff like that. Okay. I'm just going to bump up the magnification here. What did I do? I dragged it in the wrong direction. Yes, you guys can complain to the dean that Tech doesn't know how to use a word processor. Darn it. Okay. All right. So what we'll do is I'm changing the topic just a little bit here and start to talk about things that are actually in the future. But since it was brought up and it is related to open source, okay, the concept of open source, one of the controversies is